Nassim Taleb, so he talks about being anti-fragile, right? So he talks about setting up guards and sort of making sure that if something happens, you become sort of come out stronger. So in a way, it's a very weird way to. So whenever even I wear my entrepreneurial hat and I read that book, it just doesn't come in accord, right? So from your vantage point, how do you grapple with that concept of being anti-fragile and on the other side embracing failures? Like what? I'm curious to know your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of anti-fragile is it's at the system level. A system benefits from big random swings because mistakes are going to go in every direction. But sometimes you discover penicillin. So if we allow for experimentation and do a lot of it and are attentive to the mistakes. And the random swings, we may benefit. And so I think Silicon Valley, in some ways, is an anti-fragile system. But that system is comprised of lots of individual actors, and you're going to get a lot of failure because people try things. They move, if you will, from the system's perspective in random directions, trying out a lot of different things, and most of them will fail and some of them will succeed brilliantly. And that's good for Silicon Valley system. It's good for society, but it's horrible for the individual entrepreneur, right? They don't have a portfolio of moves they're making. They make one move and it's either in the right direction or more likely it's in the wrong direction. So, but for whatever reason, as a species, we're wired up to have at least some fraction of our organisms that will sort of go out to the frontier and try something new. We're lucky. It's easy to imagine us being a bunch of hedgehogs and everybody goes in a hole.
Fair point. So, if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm reading this book, what would you suggest? What would you suggest me, like if I want to make myself to be resilient to failure, or it will what will you tell me? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, odds are high you're an early stage entrepreneur. And so I would tell you about the early stage failure patterns and how to avoid them. Three big things stand out. One of the early stage failure patterns has to do with having a good idea, but not being able to mobilize the entire set of players that have to come together to make that idea a reality. I call this good idea, bad bedfellows. And it's not just the founder, the jockey, it's also the other team members, it's the investors. Many entrepreneurs will have partners, right? The definition of entrepreneurship is doing something new without resources. Who has resources? Big companies. So a lot of entrepreneurs will partner with big companies, and that can be a messy business, a difficult business. And so it turns out that there's some businesses where industry experience is super crucial. I spoke in the beginning about this apparel company. That's an example of a business where you really need to know something about designing and manufacturing clothing. There are all these specialized roles: pattern maker, fabric sourcer, quality control, and they all have to fit together. And these entrepreneurs didn't have fashion industry design and manufacturing experience, so they made some mistakes in the kinds of people they brought into the company. Bad bedfellows. They couldn't attract the right investors. Bad bedfellows. The factories that actually manufactured their clothing didn't pay attention to them because they were a little peanut with no industry relationships. So their orders got pushed to the end, and in order to expedite an order for somebody else. And so industry experience turned out to have been very important there. If you look at a food and beverage startup, same thing. What kind of packaging will jump off the shelf? What's a co-packer and how do you work with them? What are slotting allowances in grocery stores? Super crucial. All these things you can get wrong. Many of the MBAs I work with are they'll create some new beverage and they'll think it'll just fly off the shelves magically. There are other businesses, many other businesses where you don't need industry experience. If you launch Instagram, you don't have to really have worked in photo sharing before or have worked for Kodak. You need an intuition. People who launch dating sites all the time usually fail, but some of them succeed, don't have experience in dating services. So sometimes it's important, sometimes it isn't. An entrepreneur needs to know which they're in. That's one. The second is a false start. The risk that in their zeal to build and launch the product and move as fast as they can, because that's what an entrepreneur does, many entrepreneurs will skip upfront research. Before they start the engineering work, the customer discovery, have we really found a strong unmet customer need? And then a good designer is going to generate a lot of solutions, because there's usually many ways to solve a problem. The entrepreneur thinks he or she can see around corners and wants to get going, so they start engineering. That first version of the product is probably going to miss the mark because they've skipped this research. So they've wasted the amount of time it takes to build it, sell it, and figure out what to do next. Let's call that 4 months. In order to save 4 months of upfront research, they've wasted 4 months later. And that's a false start, and it kills a lot of startups. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, you can still pivot away from the flawed first version, but if you've only got a year's worth of capital in the bank, either because you're bootstrapping or that's how much money you were able to raise, to waste 4 months out of 12 is a bad idea. And then the last thing I tell entrepreneurs, early stage entrepreneurs, is to watch out for false positives. So it turns out that every business needs early adopters. If you're lucky as an entrepreneur, there'll be some people out there that are just banging on your door. They want your product now. They've been waiting for it for a long time. And it's very tempting to expand aggressively in the direction of those early adopters and to give them what they want, the feature set they're looking for. It's often the case that the early adopters have needs that for features that are different than those of the mainstream customers. And Dropbox is a great example, right? Drew Houston, his early adopters were software engineers, people with incredibly sophisticated requirements for file management, working on multiple devices, collaborating with other people, big files, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in his Y Combinator application, he talked about wanting to create a service that was so easy to use his mother could use it to store her recipes. So he had this nuanced understanding of the difference between mainstream and early adopter, and he had the discipline to not give the early adopters what they want. Sometimes you should, and then you should migrate over time. Sometimes your mainstream product will be good enough for the early adopters. So you need to understand the difference, and you need a strategy for dealing with that, any difference that you find.